Okay. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining this session on managing and maximizing your scholarly impact. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Kathleen Flynn, and I'm one of the science librarians here at UAlbany. And you may have noticed I've altered the settings. I've disabled the participant video and unmuting right now just because I'm recording, and that makes it easier. And I've also enabled closed captioning, so feel free to hit the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you'd like to see the live transcript. So the purpose of this session is to help you understand the common ways that a researcher's scholarly impact is evaluated with metrics and how those metrics don't always give the full story of the value and impact of your work. So I'll talk about the uses and limitations of some of the most commonly used metrics and some ways to develop and improve the reach of your scholarship, your scholarly profiles, and how you describe your impact. So for better or worse, we live in a world where we like to measure the value of things with data and statistics. I'm sure many or all of you have heard the phrase publish or perish. This is used to describe the environment that researchers, especially those on the tenure track, find themselves in because they feel like the only way to get tenure and to keep their job is to publish in high impact journals, get as many publications as possible, and or get as many citations as possible. And this can be particularly stressful since not only do research and writing processes take a lot of time, but the time to publish, for instance, even an article, it can take maybe a month or two, but it could take a year or more from submission to publication. So this can lead to some unethical scientific practices such as data manipulation or plagiarism or salami publications where an author deliberately divides the results from one project or a data set into as many publications as possible because they feel like they need to. And it can also discourage innovative research because you might feel like you need to just get something published quickly that will be trendy and get read and cited quickly. Now, an important thing to know is when you publish something, such as an article, the publisher will ask you to sign a publishing agreement, and these agreements give them the right to publish your work, but they also frequently ask that you transfer some or all of your copyright rights to the publisher. It is possible to negotiate with publishers so that you don't lose these rights. There's a nonprofit organization, Spark. I've linked to an addendum that they created so authors can try to attach that to their agreements to help negotiate keeping their rights. But in general, always read those agreements and keep a copy so you know what the agreement was, what you possibly signed away, and what your rights are. So that publishing agreement that I just described, it's common in the traditional publishing model. So in this model, authors submit manuscripts to journals for peer review, but the authors don't need to pay anything to publish, although some journals may charge page charges. But authors give the publisher the copyright to their work, so the work will then be behind a paywall, so readers need to have a subscription or pay to read the article. And authors do usually have the ability to self-archive a free version of their work, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then the other type of publishing is open access publishing, and this can come in a few flavors. So in this model, the authors still submit manuscripts to journals for peer review, but the articles will be freely available to read with no subscription. So instead of charging the readers to read the articles, the journals charge the authors to publish them. And these fees are usually called article processing charges or APCs. But authors get to keep their copyright. And of course, they can also self-archive a free version in another location if they wish. So as we just saw, open access literature would be uh, work that's online. It's free of charge. It's free of most of the copyright and licensing restrictions. And as I said, it can come in a few flavors, such as self-archiving in a free version, usually in an online repository, or publishing through a publisher. You may hear about a few types of open access journals: gold, diamond, green, hybrid. In all of these, the publications are free to read, and free of most copyright restrictions. The differences are where the publications are published and if the authors need to pay to publish. So gold open access is very common. These journals will charge those APC fees to authors to publish their works open access. So some of these journals will be fully open access, but nowadays most journals are at least hybrid. So with a hybrid journal, authors have a choice. They can pay the fee if they'd like to make it open access, or they can stick to the traditional model and put it behind a paywall and not pay, and the journal will take their copyright. And then there are diamond open access journals where they do not charge fees to authors or readers. These are less common, as you would expect, since this would require the publisher to have other sources of funding. And then finally, there's green open access, and that's where the author self-archives a free version of their work in a repository. And there are no fees for that version either. So I bring up open access publishing because there are a lot of benefits to the researcher, their readers, and the scholarly community. It can increase the visibility and access of your scholarship. This is important for science because science builds on the scholarship of others. Also, readers that might struggle to afford access to scholarship can benefit from open access content. Your work can be shared quicker, it can lead to more citations, and all of these things can be presented as reasons that your work has had an impact on communities. And additionally, funding agencies are increasingly requiring public access to research outputs that were created with taxpayer funding, so you may have to make some version of it open access, but it's also beneficial in general. Now, these open access journals and the hybrid journals, they're pretty common now, but researchers still sometimes have concerns about reputations of newer open access journals compared to the more established journals. So that's one negative. And of course, you also have those fees that you may have to pay. So that's an issue. And because of that, there are some journals that have been labeled predatory journals, which we'll talk about a little later. These are basically illegitimate journals that try to trick authors out of their money. So remember that when you uh, produce a piece of scholarship, be it an article or book, etc., you start out as the copyright holder. And as the copyright holder, you have this bundle of rights. You can control how your work will be reproduced, distributed, performed, displayed, or modified unless you transfer some or all of those rights to someone else in a signed agreement. If you don't want to publish in an open access journal, possibly because you don't have the funds to pay the fee, you can still self-archive a free version in a repository, which we mentioned earlier. Journals are usually okay with this, provided that you self-archive a particular version of the article, and they'll let you know which version is acceptable to them. It's usually the accepted manuscript version. So that's the one that went through peer review, but has not yet been formatted and published, all typesetted and nice. UAlbany actually has an open access policy. It was developed and passed by faculty in 2021, and this can help you with that. It only applies to scholarly articles published after that policy was passed. So in practice, you're giving the university permission to reproduce, display, and distribute your articles, including permission to make open access versions of your articles available in our institutional repository, Scholars Archive, which we'll talk about in a second. There's also a no questions asked waiver that you can submit for an article if you don't want to make it open access or if there are insurmountable issues with the publisher. But if you'd like to participate with the policy, you could just fill out this form, and I'm going to share the slides later. And you could fill out this form. You could create an account in Scholars Archive and self-submit, or you could contact us for assistance. If you would like to publish your work in an open access or a hybrid journal, the libraries do have some options to help with those fees. Some of our subscriptions are what we call transformative agreements. So traditionally, libraries have subscriptions that give patrons read access to journals. They let you read the articles. But with a transformative agreement, our subscription includes that read access, but it also covers open access fees for UAlbany corresponding authors. So we've been looking at agreements so far that are more or less cost neutral for the libraries, and we also want them to cover unlimited APCs. So at the moment, we have agreements with the following publishers here, Cambridge University Press, the Institute of Physics, the American Chemical Society, and the Association for Computing Machinery. So if you or another UAlbany researcher are the corresponding author for work, you could publish open access in the journals from these publishers at no cost. So feel free to reach out with any questions about these deals, and the link on this slide goes to a webpage with some more info as well. Another common way that authors can share a free version of their work is by sharing a preprint. So these preprints, these will be manuscripts of original scholarly research that have not yet been peer reviewed and or published in a journal. So this is a little different than sharing the accepted manuscript, since that has gone through peer review. And then a preprint server would be the repository that authors can use to upload their preprints, and they can get a number of benefits that you can see here. You'll notice that they're similar to the other open access publishing benefits. There are many preprint servers. The main ones for the sciences are here. We have Archive, bioRxiv, and chemarchive. Archive was the original here. It was launched in 1991, and it mostly contains preprints in physics, but in recent years it's expanded to include areas such as math and computer science, and it has over 2 million preprints. And then bioRxiv is for biology, chemarchive is for chemistry. So researchers could upload a preprint in a preprint server for free. But of course, the preprints may have to meet certain criteria, such as being in the scope of the server or formatting or whatnot. Now, Archive is very well established and popular in these fields. So it's a great example of how preprints could be a great way to share and promote your work with the widest audience. Not all preprint servers are as popular as Archive, but they're becoming a little more popular. And these are some multidisciplinary repositories, OSF, SSRN, and Zenodo. So you could browse those and see if one might work for your work. So we just saw some repositories a second ago, like Archive and bioRxiv, but there are also some repositories run by academic institutions. And these are also a tool for collecting, sharing, and preserving scholarship, but in this case, it's mostly the institution's scholarship, and they're usually open access as well. And these are important because they help showcase and preserve the institution's scholarly work and research output, particularly if it's unique content that's not found elsewhere. And there's also an equity piece because you're removing content from behind paywalls. So you're providing access to others that might not be able to afford those subscription costs. And this helps us fulfill our mission as a library and as a university. So our institutional repository, it's called Scholars Archive, and we mentioned that a little earlier. And it's managed by the libraries, and you can see some statistics here. The content in our repository is mostly from faculty, but student work can also be added. For instance, lately we've been working on getting the digital copies of student dissertations and theses in there. At the moment, they've been behind a paywall in a database from a vendor ProQuest that we have, and which we'll still have, but we will also have free copies in our repository. There are already some in there now if you wanted to check them out. So other student work can also be added. It may need a faculty sponsor. It has to be scholarly, but it is a possibility. So reach out to us if you're interested in that. This is just a list of examples of the scholarship that could be added to Scholars Archive. You'll see some things like journal articles. They could also live, of course, in a journal or a discipline-specific repository. So you could publish it in a journal and then put a free version in Scholars Archive. So you're widening your audience there. But some things here, like white papers or presentations, conferences, they may not have a natural home elsewhere, so repositories like Scholars Archive can help fill that gap. And you'll notice it can also store data sets. So by sharing your work in Scholars Archive, you're also growing your web presence. The content in Scholars Archive, it's fully indexed and searchable. It's crawled by search engines like Google and Google Scholar. They, there are also analytic tools that let you see how widely your work is being discovered, how your readership changed over time. So this info could be useful when you're describing the reach and the impact of your work. For instance, this is a study shared by one of our librarians, and it wasn't formally published, but you can see here it's been downloaded over 500 times since it was first shared in 2019. And you can also see in this record, there are some other useful things other than the download counts. We have Creative Commons licensing that can be applied. So this helps inform people on what they can and can't do with your work. We have a DOI. So if you're unfamiliar with those are persistent identifiers for resources. So this will help preserve the resource so that people can access it and link to it. And you can also link to your uh, the author's ORCID profile. We'll look at those a little bit in a second. And you also see some alt metrics, which we'll look at a little bit later too. So if you do put something in Scholars Archive, it will send you some regular emails with updates on your download counts, and you can look at your author dashboard. So let me check out here. I have an example here. This is an author dashboard, so you could see, I could zoom in and see where downloads have been happening for the work, the institutions, countries where those downloads have been coming from, where people have been linking from. So I see Google a lot and Google Scholar. Up in the left, I can also see more usage info, like downloads over time. This would be some alt metrics, which we'll look at a little bit later. So that's an example of how you could get more info about who's reading your work, when it's being downloaded, etc. for Scholars Archive. So now let's talk about scholarly metrics, because everyone's looking for ways to measure how impactful a research output has been. There are a lot of metrics out there. They all have benefits and limitations. So it's good to present a fuller picture of your work if you're making the case for yourself. So you may be aware of citation counts, but this is just basically the number of times that a publication has been cited in another publication since it was published. So this is an article level metric, and it's measuring the impact of an article or any other publication that could be cited. There are a number of databases or tools that can track a publication citation count. One that's commonly used for promotion and tenure reviews is called Web of Science, and we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. But this is also just a large multidisciplinary database. You can search for articles and books and conference proceedings and whatnot in it. So it's a very large, useful tool, but it also tracks citations and some other things that we'll look at. But Web of Science, it's very selective about the sources, such as journals that it indexes and tracks. Therefore, it will only track citations by publications contained in Web of Science. So it's not going to find every possible citation because it's really picky. And then there's Scopus. That's another large multidisciplinary database. It's a competitor to Web of Science. And again, it will only count citations to publications found within Scopus. So you'll notice that citation counts will vary depending on which tool is collecting the count because they're looking at different sources. So in tools like Web of Science and Scopus, because they're so selective, the sources that they index, they do tend to just be scholarly sources. So that's good, but they won't, because they're so picky, it won't be every possible scholarly source. And there could be some overlaps as well. So their citation counts won't be perfect, but at least you can feel confident that the citations are from scholarly sources at least, but not exhaustive. And then you have Google Scholar. This is uh, another tool, but the difference between this and, say, Web of Science is Google Scholar will just comb the web for any citation or mention to a publication. So that you'll notice that the Google Scholar citation count for, say, an article will be not only higher, but maybe even double what the Web of Science citation count will be. And that's just because Google Scholar will track citations to from scholarly sources. For instance, those from Web of Science and also those that Web of Science doesn't include because it's so picky. But it will also look at things that are maybe non-scholarly, but still valid, but also things like podcasts, or sometimes there are duplicates in there. Sometimes there are even suspicious citations. So none of these counts are perfect, is the bottom line here. But uh, looking at more than one can give you a fuller picture. Journals also frequently keep track of citation counts for their works, and they use usually the service Crossref or others. But another thing to keep in mind is that authors can also cite themselves, and this is fine, and you actually need to cite yourself if you're referring to it. But people can game the system a little bit and artificially inflate their citation counts if they choose to. So people might ask you to show your citation count excluding self-citations. So be aware of that. And I know I've been talking about articles a lot, but databases like Web of Science also index some books and conference proceedings, patents, etc. So they may also have citation counts. So let's take a look at an example of a citation count I have here in Google Scholar. So this is just an article I found, and I went to Google Scholar and just pasted it, and this came up. So we see here, let me just make this a little bigger so you can see it. Here it says cited by 80,000, so that's abnormally large. This is an older article. I looked for articles that were some of the most cited. So I could click this if I wanted to view those publications that cited this. So that's what it looks like in Google Scholar. Here's that same article from the publisher. So you'll notice here on the right, we see some altmetrics, which we'll look at a little later. But down here, this publisher is keeping track of it. I see it here, 67,000 citations. So you'll notice that's lower than Google Scholar. And again, that's because it's looking at different things. It's not going to consider citations, every single citation. They're all picky in different ways. And publishers, their websites look differently, so where you'll see the citation count, it will vary. So let's look at it in Web of Science. So I linked in the slides to Web of Science, but if you want to know how to find it from our library website, you'd go to library.albany.edu and you go up to Tools at the top, and then there's Database Finder. So you could browse our databases in a number of ways, but this one's called Web of Science, so I'll just go to the W here. So it's this one right here. And again, this you could also use to search for for literature as well. It's a very large multidisciplinary database. So what I could do, if I have an article title and I want to know how many citations it has, here I could just paste it in here, and it pulled it up, matched it here, and I see 67,000. You'll notice it is similar to the journal's citation count, but So it's lower than Google Scholar again, but it is slightly different from the journal's count because again, it's tracking different things. So there is a little more nuance in Web of Science, but this is the main citation count here. But another thing I wanted to point out in Web of Science, and I'll go back to do just a test search. Sometimes Web of Science will uh, mark something as highly cited. They'll give it a little label or a hot paper. So on the left here with our filters, I'm just going to filter to a highly cited paper just to show you what that looks like. So this one here, I see this one has 558 citations, so I could have that number and click to view those. But right here, I have this little award here. And if I click it, it says that this paper had enough citations to be in the top 1% of the field of computer science. Now, this is a Web of Science category, which we'll look at in a second. So this is another thing. If any of your publications have these labels, I would put that in your CV, any kind of statement you're writing. I would use this as more evidence of the impact of your work. So those are publication citation counts. But another metric that you've maybe heard of is the journal impact factor. This is a very established metric. It's supposed to represent basically how many citations the average article in a journal will receive in a given year. And many authors look to this before deciding what journal to publish in, but it's complicated just like all of the other metrics. So it's not a perfect metric. It's not the only way to evaluate a journal, but institutions do like to use it for promotion and tenure reviews, so it's important to be aware of it. Now, the journal impact factor, it's a proprietary metric. It's from the company Clarivate. It's the same one that makes the database Web of Science that we were just in. So you'd find it in that database Web of Science. There is a similar metric from Web of Science's competitor Scopus. It's called CiteScore. And there are other similar metrics as well, like the eigenfactor or SNP, but the journal impact factor, it's still considered the gold standard. So to calculate it, here's the formula that Clarivate uses. They're basically saying for the 2023 journal impact factor, they take citations in 2023 to items published in the previous 2 years over the number of citable items in those 2 years. And I put a description here for how you would locate the tool. It's in Web of Science, but it's in a product called Journal Citation Reports. And I have a screenshot here for how you would get to that, but let's go to that now. So if I'm on the Web of Science, the page you'll come to when you follow the library link, what you do is you go up to products here in the top and then journal citation reports. So from here, I could search for a journal here in the search box, or I could browse down here. We'll look at categories in a second, but let's search for a particular journal. There's the journal Science. So if you don't know, this is one of the more prestigious journals. It's a really large multidisciplinary journal. It pretty much covers all of the sciences and a little bit of the social sciences. So I see it's this one right here. And when I go to its page here, I see some information about it, publisher, the ISSN. So this is that unique identifier for the journal, so I can know if this is the right journal. And the impact factor year here is 2023. So because of the way it's calculated, the impact factor year is always going to be a year behind. So 2023 is the most current impact factor. So if I scroll down, I see right here, I'll try to make this a little bigger. The 2023 impact factor for this journal is 44.8. So if you're not familiar with impact factors, that's very low, that's very high. And you notice it's also here giving the impact factor without self-citations. So that's useful. And it gives some information here about how it calculated that. But if I scroll down a little bit more, ignoring these things here, journals in Web of Science are also put in categories. This one just happens to be in one, but it can be in more than one, and we'll see an example of that in a second. But this one is in this category multidisciplinary sciences because, again, it's just a huge journal. It sort of covers almost anything in the sciences. So in that category, it's ranked right now 3 out of 134. It's in the first quartile here. We can see the history of its rank over time. Uh, but that's this journal. Let's go back and I'll look at categories. Here's where I could browse those categories. And there are a lot of big categories here, but then if I just click agricultural sciences, I see there are a lot of uh, more specific categories here. I'll just click this one. So this is agricultural economics and policy. So that's a bit niche. And when I see these 39 journals in this subcategory, over here it's sorting by the impact factor. So you see the journal that's ranked number 1 in this category, its impact factor is 6.8. So you remember science, it was 44.8. So you may look at this and say, oh, well, is this a bad journal then? But no, because you have to remember that science is such a huge multidisciplinary journal. Number one, it's not really fair to compare between disciplines. There are also different disciplines have different publication and citation habits. They vary. But this journal here is called Food Policy. That's pretty niche. So let's click this one. So I see its impact factor here. And if I scroll down, this one's in a few categories. So it's ranked number 1 out of 39 in this agricultural economics and policy. It's also here in economics. This is a broader category. And it's first quartile. It's 22 out of 600, but it's in some others here. So if you're looking for a journal to publish in, you'd have to think, let's say you have a paper that's about economics, but maybe it's not really food policy. So maybe it wouldn't be the best option for you, but maybe food policy is the best journal in that, you know, niche field. So in general, it's better to look at a journal in its own category or among its peers and not compare to the big journals like Science. So as I already said, some disciplines publish more articles, some have more citations in their papers, uh, some other downsides, of course, of the impact factor and also citation counts because they're related is that a citation is not necessarily positive. Somebody could be citing something to refute it. Uh, some highly cited journals, articles might be affecting the calculation. You also have those self citations that can affect it, but we did see that Web of Science does also provide the impact factor excluding self-citations. So a self-citation for a journal would be citations to other articles from the journal you're publishing in, and some less honest journals may even encourage authors to cite articles from the journal. So that's why that second impact factor in Web of Science is there. And then, of course, you have review articles. Those tend to have more citations. They get cited more. So some journals only publish reviews, so they can have really high impact factors. And then another downside is for the impact factor, if you're not in a STEM field, Web of Science has really good coverage in the STEM fields, not as much coverage in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, but a decent amount. Another big metric that you'll see is an author level metric. So this is a method of evaluating an author's career, and it's called the H index. So here, an example, H index would be an H index of 5 means that that author has 5 publications that have at least 5 citations each. And many databases such as Web of Science or Google Scholar, they will list an H index for an author, and of course they'll be using their citation counts, so they might vary. H index varies a little less than the citation counts just because of how it's calculated. And Google Scholar also has another similar metric. It's called the I-10 index. That's just the number of an author's publications that have at least 10 citations. So to calculate this manually, what you do, let's say on the left here, this is fictional, this author had 9 publications. I found the citation counts, sorted most to least, and then found the H index. So here I'm saying the H index is 6 because I can say that this author has 6 publications, these 6 here, that each have at least 6 citations. I can't say it's 7 because I can't say they have 7 publications that each have 7 or more citations. But with this person over here, I'd say 7. I'd say they have 7 publications and they each have at least 7 citations. So the H-index could be good if you're comparing researchers at similar stages in their careers in similar fields, but it's also not good to compare across disciplines for the same reasons that we already talked about. You know, disciplines some can have higher citation counts than others, and publications are more likely to have citations over time. So an older publication, it takes a while to write a paper and cite something. Of course, you have review articles that might have more. If it's mainstream research, it's trendy, that might have more. So early career researchers can be disadvantaged here. It's also a little biased against highly cited papers. So in this example here, this person had an H index of 6, but they have a couple of publications with hundreds of citations, whereas this person has fewer citations, but their H index was 7. So you might say, well, that doesn't seem fair. But again, you also have to think these could be in different disciplines. So maybe in the person on the right, maybe it's normal for them to not have, it would be weird to have hundreds of citations for an article. So again, it's not good to compare um, across disciplines. And the H-index also doesn't consider self-citations or things like author placements in some fields. Being the first author or the last author has significance. So those are some of the most popular traditional metrics, but as I said, they aren't perfect, and researchers always want other ways to prove impact. So alt metrics became a thing, and these would be things like mentions in social media or mainstream media or social reference managers such as Mendeley. So as social media has become more popular, people think alt metrics are a good way to measure immediate impact of research as opposed to waiting around for people to cite your paper, because that can take some time. So it has the potential to produce higher counts since it's much simpler to just mention an article than cite it. But currently they're still not as accepted as those traditional metrics, possibly because they're not considered as valuable for promotion and tenure. And of course, there's another fear, just like the regular metrics, traditional can be manipulated. You could do the same here. You could have fake social media accounts, for instance. So in general, they're considered supplemental to traditional metrics. And these are some example services here. We have Plumex metrics and altmetric.com. So let's look at some examples of what those would look like. Here's an example article here. We saw briefly in another article here on the right. This is from Plumex. So I could click View Details. So I could see some citation counts, but also blog and social media mentions. And then this is a different example in another journal. This uses altmetric.com. And I can see some info here, news outlets, social media, patents, etc. So you could use these to provide a little more info about your impact. And this is just a list of the altmetrics tracked by altmetrics.com, and then the same thing for Plumex. And there are links here where they go into more detail about what they track and how. So if you're writing some kind of research impact statement, you can include all those traditional metrics like citation counts and downloads, the journal impact factor, etc. But there are some other things here that you could include that they also give some context, they have value. So things like your funding received, awards, if you've been invited to present at conferences, or if you've organized a conference, any kind of evidence that your work is implemented in your field. So if you wrote a book and it's the textbook of a course, that would be useful, or anything that's course material. If you have something on GitHub, you can track the forks or watchers. Other things like being on editorial boards or being a peer reviewer, if you've been interviewed or been quoted in media, other publication types. And then I know I talk a lot about articles, but for books, you can track how many libraries have a copy, and you could use this website WorldCat here to do that. And then other things like if it's been on bestseller lists, if you've been invited to author signings, if there are good reviews, etc. So we just talked about things like having high impact factor journals and a lot of citations, etc. But another way to promote yourself and get more views for your work is by having verified author profiles. So on the right here, we can see some examples of researcher profiles you may recognize. We're going to look at a couple in a second, but these profiles can help you in a few ways. You can differentiate your work from other authors with similar names. You can share profiles that have all of your publications, so it's easy to see your work. You can connect with other researchers. You can comply with some funder requirements. So one of the most useful profiles is called ORCID, and this is a free and unique and persistent identifier for authors. So authors can distinguish themselves from others. It's especially useful if you have a really common name or if you've changed your name over the years. You can still just have that one profile with all of your publications uh, across any name change. Many publishers now require that you have an ORCID and that you link to it when you submit your manuscript. So you may have to create one, but it's useful. And a great thing about it is you could manually add publications if you wish. This could be nice if it's something like a presentation or something that wasn't published in a traditional venue. You can still include it there. But you can also link in your ORCID profile, link to the service Crossref, and it will automatically add publications once they're published, since journals also tend to use Crossref and they'll communicate. And also another benefit, if you're applying for federal funding, and you're completing a Science CV biosketch with biographical info about you, you can, in that system, link to your ORCID, and it will auto-populate a lot of those fields, so it can make that process easier. And then another common author profile is Google Scholar, and those are also free. So authors can verify their accounts with their email, and then they can clean up their profiles, because sometimes there'll be things in there that aren't theirs, or things will be missing. And other databases such as Web of Science, they've been introducing computer generated author profiles. They're not the most accurate because the algorithm isn't perfect, but authors can also verify their accounts, then clean them up. But not a lot of authors do that in Web of Science. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's ORCID. This is a fictional ORCID record. So creating an account would just take a couple minutes. It's super easy. This is the icon you've possibly seen when you look at a journal article. You see this next to the author's name, and usually the author's name will be a link that will go to this profile. So this can be nice if you publish something and the reader clicks, they can click your name and view all of your publications in one nice spot, and you can share this link. So you can give info about yourself, your current employment, and your works here. And these you see DOIs, so these are links to those publications. So ORCID is very useful. I recommend it. But here's Google Scholar, and most people have a Google Scholar profile as well. And this is one for Einstein, so he didn't make this. And you see there's no verified email for the obvious reason, but if you did verify your profile, it would say here that it was verified. So you see in an author profile here in Google Scholar, you can see their total citation count, and of course the citation count per publication, and also their H index and that I-10 index for Google Scholar. And then there's an example here in Web of Science. This is that fictional profile again, and you see here it says it's algorithmically generated. And if you wanted to, you could claim your record. Sometimes authors have multiple records because the algorithm, like I said, it's not the best right now, so you could clean it up. So here you could see your publications and the Web of Science citation count and your total citation count and H-index, and you can have a more detailed citation report. So this could be also another nice tool. But it's also important to publish in the appropriate place so that you don't hurt your reputation. As I said earlier, for open access publishing, most of the time a reader pays a subscription or a one-time fee to read an article, but with open access, usually it's the authors paying a fee to the journal to publish. But the issue with this is those journals make profit off of those author fees. So the more articles they publish, the more money they make. So you might wonder, why would they be careful and selective and do good peer review, and ensure quality and credibility when they could just publish as many as possible and make the most money? So some open access journals have a reputation of being what we call a predatory journal. There's some background information on that here, but basically those are just journals. They falsely claim to be scholarly peer-reviewed journals to trick authors into submitting materials so that they can just make money. So those can be harmful in a few ways. If you're in that publish or perish environment, you're a little desperate, you might, quickly just publish in whatever you find, and then you discover it's a fraudulent journal. That can harm your career. It could be difficult to get your paper back. Once that's out there, though, researchers and students, they might discover those articles, they might use them or cite them, and those, possibly haven't been peer reviewed, so that's a little dangerous. And then, of course, your work could disappear because that illegitimate journal probably won't preserve it. They might not even exist in the near future. They probably go out of business at some point. So some common characteristics of a predatory journal, usually the main point is they don't give a lot of information about themselves and their processes. So their scope will be really broad, or they won't even list a scope. A lot of times they try to spoof you. A journal title, it might be similar to a well-known journal title. They can even sometimes take over a website. Um, a lot of times spelling and grammatical errors are common. A big thing is they won't have an online submission portal. They'll just say, email me the manuscript. Sometimes, a lot of times they won't have a ISSN, so that unique identifier for a journal. The editorial board will either be fake, so fake people with no contact info, no affiliations. Sometimes they are real people, but they didn't ask for permission to include them. They just put people there. They tend to spam people emails to request manuscripts, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the big thing is they allege a very short review process, maybe just days to a couple of weeks, and peer review can take a while. So I know it's tempting to publish quickly. You might really need to, but if a journal tells you, oh, from submission to publication, it'll just be a week, that's really suspicious. So be wary of that. But in general, they just don't give a lot of information about their peer review process, their copyright, their fees, anything like that. So let's take a look at a credible journal. This is not a predatory journal. This is Physical Review A. So if I was looking at this, I see a few things, and every journal homepage will look a little differently. So they have an about page here. So here I see journals tend to list their impact factor if they have one, but sometimes a predatory journal will either make one up or they'll call it something like the global impact factor or something like that. But this journal is giving me a lot of info about their scope and their criteria, about open access. There'll be more about their policies, any fees. They have info about their editorial board and these names and info about these people, their affiliations. So I could try to contact these people. They have lots of other pages here about their policies, peer review, and integrity, all sorts of things, submission, guidelines. So basically, you're just looking for information on information. Predatory journals tend to be really sparse on information. And as I said a minute ago, they tend to cold email people invitations to submit a manuscript or to present at a conference. And, sometimes it's reasonable for a journal or a conference to put out a call for submissions, but that's usually somewhere like a listserv or on a website. I get these scam emails all the time, so you probably will at some point too. They tend to just be from publishers you don't recognize. They contain errors in their spelling or whatever honorific they use for you. They tend to just praise your previous publications, promise a really fast publication process. A lot of times the journal or the conference really won't be in your field of research, so it's kind of obvious that they're just randomly emailing you. And there are a couple of links here with some more info and some example emails that you might get if you wanted to see a sample. So when you're considering which journal to submit your manuscript to, some things to consider would be, would you or your peers read or cite this journal? Does your article match their scope and their audience? You could email, sometimes people email the editor to ask to confirm if it's within the scope. That's an option. Does the journal comply with any funder requirements you might have? You could check its impact factor or its reputation in your field in general. Ask your colleagues. If it is open access and you're interested in that, make sure you might have the funds to pay any APC. And there are also some other criteria here to use to evaluate a journal. And if you're curious, there are some newer tools. Some publishers are increasingly making these that try to suggest a journal for your manuscript. If it's from a publisher, it will be publisher specific, you know. So let's look at one example from Elsevier. So they're going to show, and I'll look at Einstein. We'll just borrow one of his abstracts here. So you could paste, a lot of times in these tools, you can paste an abstract or other keywords, whatnot here. So I'll paste an abstract and see. So this is Elsevier suggesting Elsevier journals that might be a good fit for this paper. So I can see some more info here about the journal scope and possible open access fees. I could go to the page. So these are options. And then these are just some other additional resources that might be helpful. And otherwise, that's it. So with that, I hope that you feel more prepared to make the best case for your work and its impact. Sorry that was a lot of info all at once, but feel free to contact me or the libraries with any questions. And thank you for joining. I know there are just a few minutes if you have any questions. Sorry it was so jam-packed with info, but the recording will be sent along probably today. And I'll put my contact info in the chat.